Hello, listeners. This is Kat, and welcome back to Put Your Hands Up Podfics. This will be the continuation of State of Mind. This will be Part 22, Chapter 15, the second half. Soon enough, everyone had eaten a small breakfast and was gathered outside, all tired expressions and messy hair. Izuku had left his own hair in a braid, and it ran down his shoulder. Still pretty tight in its braid since he had been unsuccessful in his attempts at sleep. Good morning, everyone. Today we will begin training to increase your strength in earnest. The goal of this training camp is to increase everyone's strength, and with that, for everyone to obtain their provisional licenses. It is to prepare you all to face hostilities that are becoming more real by the minute. Proceed carefully. Aizawa abruptly looked at Izuku, who flinched at the sudden intense stare. Nova, try throwing that. He tossed him a ball with wires sticking out of it. Oh, like from the fitness test, Izuku thought, a small smirk alighting his features as he remembered when he had used his original quirk to just yeet the ball into the mindscape. He noted that Aizawa had made sure to tell him to throw it this time, instead of the broad term of expel. Aizawa was watching him knowingly, as if he knew what Izuku was thinking. Your previous record, from right after you started school, was 906.3 meters. Let's see how you've improved. Izuku walked forward to get away from everyone as they excitedly chattered amongst themselves. Izuku smiled. He had much better control of One For All now, and he was not as afraid of using it as he had been. Izuku reeled back his arm, activating full cowling. With a deep breath, Izuku flung his arm forward. Arcs of lightning tore Izuku's sleeve as a sonic boom ripped through the air and Izuku's fingers left the ball. He turned around to face everyone, smiling shyly and scratching at his now bared arm. He didn't know why he'd even bothered with sleeves today. Aizawa looked at his phone when it beeped, surprised it had beeped so quickly after Izuku had thrown it. The area around his eyes immediately tightened, and he face-palmed before turning the phone around to face Izuku and then the class. Null is what the screen read. You literally destroyed the ball, kid. Why are you like this? Izuku blushed, toeing the ground. Aizawa sighed. Bakugo, you try. I have a spare ball because I thought something like this would happen. Your score during the quirk assessment test was 705.2. Bakugo caught the ball and stalked forward, propelling the ball forward with a cocky blast of his quirk and a "Go to hell!" 709.6 meters. There was a beat as everyone realized how small of an improvement that was. It's been about 3 months since you started high school. Through various experiences, you all have definitely improved, but that improvement has mainly been at the mental and technical levels, with some increase in stamina. Aizawa met each of their eyes. As you can see, your quirks themselves have not improved that much. That's why we'll work on improving your quirks starting today. A horrible, evil grin spread across their teacher's face, and Izuku almost stepped back at Aizawa's dark glee. It'll be so hard you'll feel like dying. Like that's new. Izuku came so close to saying that he physically slapped a hand over his mouth. He might not be suicidal anymore, but the dark humor never went away. But try not to actually die. Aizawa finished with that same depraved smile. They were set to work after that, each one of them given different tasks based on their quirks. Izuku was left as the last one without an assignment, and he tapped his fingers together nervously as Aizawa approached him and nodded for him to follow him a bit away from everyone else, into the shadows of a large tree. Izuku, you have 2 quirks, Aizawa said blatantly, and Izuku stiffened, eyes widening. That's not what he had expected his teacher to say. What? He choked out. Aizawa sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. I've known for a while, kid. If you want to keep it a secret from your classmates, that's fine, but I need to know what both quirks are to train you properly. Izuku swallowed, glancing around himself before smoothing his hands on the legs of his gym uniform. Eventually he sighed heavily, giving in. He trusted Aizawa. My first quirk is state of mind. I got it when I was 10. Apparently it was late, but stress induced it. That's all the mind stuff I can do. The rain and my mindscape and stuff. Izuku pulled his scarf forward, tugging on it anxiously. The other one was given to me. Aizawa leaned his head back, frowning. Given? Izuku nodded. I won't tell you who, but this quirk is passed down. A stockpile quirk. It's responsible for the super strength and green lightning that you see when I use it. You said stockpile quirk, so it enhanced your original quirk. Izuku nodded hesitantly. Izuku, when did you receive this quirk? A few months before the entrance exams. Izuku bit his cheek. Aizawa shook his head. You are a problem child, kid. Izuku shrugged. All right. Am I right in assuming this should remain a secret? Izuku nodded rapidly again. Aizawa looked at the sky, heaving a sigh before directing his attention back to Izuku. What do you think you need the most practice in, problem child? Aizawa asked. Izuku frowned, pondering. Probably keeping multiple people in my mindscape that don't actually want to be there. How many people have you sent at a time, and for how long did they stay? Aizawa was thinking, wondering how to go about training the quirk. 2 people, for 1 hour, Izuku answered confidently, remembering Gran Torino and All Might and the strange looks they had come out with and the headache he'd had afterward. Aizawa eyed Izuku's classmates from afar. You could try the entire class. Izuku tilted his head and then shrugged. That would not be bad training to strengthen his mindscape. Okay, well, go practice hand-to-hand with Tiger. And then I will call for a break later, and you can try your other quirk. Izuku nodded and gave a small bow before turning away and heading off to find Tiger and let him know that he was supposed to practice hand-to-hand combat with him. Tiger ended up being almost as bad as Gran Torino when it came to combat practice, and Izuku was extremely exhausted, the lack of sleep not helping the circumstances, by the time Aizawa called for dinner, only telling all of 1A to line up first. Izuku approached them as they all did as their teacher asked, though confused as to why. Izuku went to stand by Aizawa as he explained what would be going on. Izuku needs to practice putting more than one person into his mindscape. So, he's going to put all of you there. Everyone, come up one at a time, starting from the left. Izuku gave an anxious smile, as the rest of the class unequivocally reacted with concern and moved anxiously. Aizawa nodded for them to begin as Izuku removed one of his gloves. The first student walked forward, Sero, who was smiling at Izuku reassuringly, as if he somehow knew how nervous Izuku was about all this. Izuku lifted his arm to shake Sero's hand, and the boy grinned, taking it. He zapped out of existence with a sharp, ripping sound. Izuku took a deep breath as Aoyama came forward next, also smiling. Izuku took his hand and teleported him. Near the main building, the pussycats stopped preparing ingredients and watched what was going on with 1A. 1B had also stopped, and were all watching from various locations, and Izuku had to fight against the feeling of eyes on his skin. After that, it was just one after the other, over and over again, until Bakugo was the only one left. The boy thrust his hand out angrily, not meeting Izuku's eyes. Izuku took it, and then he was gone, with the rest of the class. Izuku glanced at Aizawa, sweat beading his forehead as he could feel the pressure building between his ears. All right, Izuku, Aizawa whispered down to him. Bring them back. Izuku nodded, breathing evenly, wondering if he should bring them back one at a time or all at once. He could feel each one of them. After a second, Izuku decided all at once would be best, and he lifted a hand, concentrating. It only took a moment before the entire class was dropping back to the earth, some landing on their feet and some very much not landing on their feet, falling sprawled onto the ground. A spear of pain lanced through his head, and Izuku swayed, forehead creasing. Aizawa grasped his shoulder, steadying him. A few crimson droplets dripped from his nose, but Izuku wiped them against his other shoulder and straightened. I'm okay, he told his teacher. Why the hell was the grass red, damn nerd? Bakugo shouted. Izuku glanced at him in confusion. Red grass. Bakugo was putting on a strong front, but Izuku could tell that he was disconcerted from being in Izuku's mindscape. Maybe he was crazy. All right, everyone, Pixie Bob shouted, stepping forward, smiling and waving her paws. Time to make your own food. Everyone practically deflated at that, stomachs growling. Izuku not so subtly pulled a jelly pack from his mindscape that he had stuck there the morning previous, before they had left the Yamada Aizawa apartment. Several of his classmates turned to face Izuku as he uncapped it and brought it up to his mouth. Midoriya, where did you get that? Kirishima yelled, catching sight of what he was doing. Izuku looked up, blinking. Midoriya, please! Mina practically screamed, coming up in front of him. I am so hungry, please give me one. He didn't have very many of them. Izuku took a step back, draining it quickly before tossing the trash in one of the bins. He then walked past them to the tables of ingredients and began laying things out while his classmates watched him in stunned confusion at his blatant disregard of them and his obvious extensive experience on how to make curry. He grabbed some knives and boards, directing Shoto to start lighting fires to warm up the pans. Soon enough, everyone was helping, coming to Izuku for the instructions on how to best make the curry for such a large number of people, since he seemed to know what he was doing. They all took turns going to go bathe and change so that the food could continue to be made. After that, they all worked together smoothly, and the food was done in a good amount of time. The two classes sat down to eat together, and Izuku sighed, settling into the seat and straightening his yellow scarf around his neck. Oh my gosh, it's so good! Mina exclaimed, eyes wide. The others began digging in, and there were several gasps of surprise. Where did you find this recipe, Izuku? It is very good, Ida asked from his side. Oh? Izuku looked up from his own dish. I didn't find it. It's mine. I've been making curry by myself since I was a kid, so I figured out what tasted the best pretty quickly. Silence. Izuku looked around, confused. Everyone was looking at him with various expressions of confusion and sadness. What? Dude. Kirishima leaned forward, looking at him from another table. Why were you making curry alone as a kid? Izuku blinked, and then shook his head, shrugging and shoving food into his mouth as an excuse not to talk. They wouldn't understand. From the corner of his vision, Izuku caught a familiar dark aura heading into the woods alone, and he shot up, swallowing a mouthful of food. Dark aura, sad child, heading into the woods, at night, alone. That combination did not sit right with Izuku, and he stood, prepared to follow. A hand caught the hem of his shirt, stopping him in place, and Izuku looked back to see Shoto watching him with an unreadable expression. Last time you were alone, the leader of the League of Villains tried to disintegrate your throat. On the other side of the table, Kota and Sato stiffened in surprise, having not known the exact circumstances of that day. It's fine, Shoto. Izuku glanced toward the direction he could feel Kota in. I'll be right back. Shoto sighed, but released him, and Izuku began walking through the woods, following the kid's presence. When Izuku found the kid, standing at the end of the cliff Tokiyami had been training with, Izuku's heart stilled in his chest before rapidly picking up speed, beating against his ribs. Izuku himself had been about Kota's age the first time he had considered death an option. He leapt upward with one for all and landed directly beside Kota, who fell back in surprise, sputtering. What are you doing? Izuku demanded, panicked. What am I doing? Kota screamed. What the heck are you doing? This is my secret hideout. How did you find this place? Izuku frowned, his heartbeat calming, barely. Oh, it was just a secret hideout. Okay, geesh, what kind of person was he to think that of a child? He was so messed up. I can, sense people. I followed your aura, I guess. Sorry. Kota scowled. What is an aura? You know the word intend, but you don't know what an aura is, Izuku asked, a smile flitting across his face. Kota's scowl deepened. Sorry. Izuku raised his hands. An aura is something that surrounds every living creature. It looks kind of like a cloud. Most people can't see them. It's part of my quirk. Whatever, just get out, Kota screamed. Izuku crouched in front of the kid, ignoring his demands. Your aura is very sad, Kota. Kota leaned back, his lip curling before changing the subject. Getting all into trying to improve your quirk is gross. You want to show off your power that badly? Izuku frowned. There was a lot to unpack with that. If you're sad, Kota, you can talk to me about it. What do you know about being sad? Kota growled, looking away. Izuku sighed, sitting down, reminding himself that this was just a kid, and a child with a dark aura at that. He had to be careful with his words. Izuku pulled his sleeves up, revealing a multitude of scars. I know about sadness, Kota. Some of these scars I got when I was your age. Kota's eyes widened, and Izuku pulled his sleeve back in place. After a minute to recover himself, Kota finally sighed. My parents were heroes. They died. His voice was bitter and angry, but Izuku could hear the absolute sadness beneath it. Everyone's crazy, calling each other stupid names like hero and villain and killing each other. Talking about quirks and stuff, it's stupid. Izuku nodded, wrapping his arms around his legs and pulling his knees against his chest. It is stupid. You're right. Kota recoiled in surprise, obviously not expecting Izuku to agree with him. What? Izuku nodded, looking out over the trees. I'm probably not the best person to help you, Izuku snorted derisively. But the world sucks sometimes. A lot of the time, really. It's messy and twisted, and there are bad people out there that hurt other people. Izuku looked at Kota. That's why heroes exist. I've needed help before, and a hero wasn't there. I don't want anyone else to go through that if I can help it. Kota searched his eyes, his own eyes watery. No one's ever said that to me before, he said, clearing his throat. Izuku wondered if anyone had ever even spoken to Kota, like an adult, had an actual conversation with him about what he was going through. Kids needed that, Izuku remembered. Izuku turned back toward the woods and shrugged. I rejected my own quirk for quite some time. I hated it. I was afraid of it, but if you reject it too much, it just becomes more painful. Kota pulled himself into his own ball, glaring down at the ground. Please leave. Izuku must have struck a nerve. Izuku glanced at the kid's aura. It was sad, maybe pensive, but not as bad as Izuku had seen his own. So with a wave, Izuku stood and walked away, down the hill and back to his classmates. He hoped he'd done something right. That night, Izuku was so exhausted that he was finally able to pass out and get at least a couple hours of sleep, until the extra lesson students returned somewhat noisily. Izuku repeated the same thing as the night before after that, drinking coffee on the stoop until breakfast, and then back to the grind, more the same quirk practice as before. After that, they were back to everyone asking Izuku advice on how to make the best meat and potato stew. Izuku even ended up having to teach Ida what a potato peeler was and how to use it. Once dinner was done and everyone had changed, it was time for the test of courage in the woods. Mandalay explained what would be going on and then divided them up into pairs. And, of course, with so many students in the extra classes, Izuku was alone. Fortunately, he had not expected much differently and was okay with it. He didn't expect to get scared anyway. The things that Izuku feared were much worse than anything his classmates could throw at him. Turned out, Izuku didn't even get a chance to do the test of courage. He was waiting for his turn to head down the path in the woods when he suddenly sensed two auras appearing behind him, as if they had been warped near, and he whirled around just in time to see Pixie Bob being dragged backwards and slammed against the ground, blood immediately gushing down her face. Izuku tensed, dropping into a self-defense posture, eyes narrowed. Villains, he growled. Why had he ever believed Aizawa when he said that the training camp would be safe? Izuku was never safe. Danger always seemed to find him. Izuku jerked forward to run to Pixie Bob's aid, but Tiger blocked him. Izuku growled at the man. Was he just going to stand there? Izuku was not going to stand by and watch someone be hurt. Wait. If there were villains here. Kota. I'm going to go get Kota, Izuku suddenly said in a quick explanation before turning and darting into the trees, Ida screaming at him to get back there. Izuku ignored him, charging through the trees and jumping over fallen logs and brambles, green lightning flickering across his skin. Izuku hurried as fast as possible. If something happened to Kota, he would never forgive himself. He was just in time. A villain's heavily muscled fist slammed the ground where Kota had been as Izuku jumped, snatching the boy up into his arms. The force of the punch knocked them to the side. Izuku's mind raced as he jumped to his feet, ripping off both gloves and shoving them into the pocket of his shorts over his galaxy print leggings. He didn't need to fight. He just could grab Kota and go. He didn't think he should put this guy into his mindscape anyway, if he could help it. Izuku could not afford to become incapacitated, and an aneurysm would definitely do that, he thought. Keeping the villain in his sights, Izuku turned halfway around. Kota, I'm going to hide you and... Izuku had been reaching forward to grab Kota, to put him into his mindscape, but before he reached him, the villain was suddenly right there, his hand wrapped around Izuku's arm, and he lifted him by it, slamming him up and into the wall of the cliff, his scarf unwinding. The pain didn't even register until Izuku hit the rocky ground. You're the one we're supposed to take, the villain laughed, looking down at him as Izuku struggled to get up, ribs protesting immensely. You and that other kid. Explosive one. Where is he? Kachan. Izuku narrowed his eyes. Why would they want either of them? Get back, Kota. Everything is fine. Izuku tried to say as calmly as possible, keeping the boy in his line of sight. The villain cackled. Sounds like you don't know where that other kid is. I'll just kill this one and grab you then. No! Izuku snarled, darting to Kota, trying to grab him and get him into his mindscape, but a massive foot, moving with a velocity that was far from fair, slammed into his ribs and redirected his path straight into the mountainside. Izuku hit it so hard, the rock cracked, his head bouncing off before he crumbled to the ground. Blood streaked down his face, and it took Izuku a second longer than before to come back to himself and to pull himself up from the ground. He could feel that multiple things were broken inside of him, and it was really not a fun time. Izuku wished he could have just done the test of courage. The villain was going on and on about muscles or some crap as Izuku got to his feet, activating full cowling. Oh, fuck off! He snarled, flinging himself forward like lightning. Before his fist could connect, it was grabbed, and he was yanked off the ground so that he was dangling from his arm, feet hovering over the rock cliffside. His scarf slid off the rest of the way, piling onto the ground. You are so weak, the villain scoffed, throwing his head back with a laugh. None of you are as strong as me. Izuku's eyes were wide as he felt the villain's grip closing around his arm, his bones creaking. Izuku mentally rifled through his mindscape, searching for something useful. He put crap in there all the time. Half of it got destroyed most of the time, but there had to be something he could use, even if it was only... Wait, was that... Izuku didn't give himself time to think. He focused, and a literal katana dropped from seemingly nowhere, the hilt landing in his hand, the point glinting in the moonlight. Faintly, Izuku remembered grabbing one of Stain's katanas when he'd swung it at him. Without hesitating, Izuku drove the blade forward and felt it where it went into the villain's body. The slight resistance of muscle and flesh, the awful grinding when it scraped against the villain's ribs. Izuku was dropped to the ground, and he immediately rolled away toward Kota. Come here, Kota! He yelled frantically, stretching his arm out. Kota was sobbing and scared, but he did what Izuku asked, reaching out. Izuku slapped his hand against the boy's smaller one, and Kota disappeared. Izuku then turned to face the villain, fraught with distress as he tried to pull the blade from his side, yelling angrily about how Izuku was a cheater. Izuku didn't give him the chance to remove the blade, leaping forward and slamming his foot against the hilt, driving it further in. The villain howled as Izuku propelled himself off the sword, slamming his fist into the villain's chin, snapping his mouth shut, and driving him backward several steps. Izuku kept up the barrage, a mad flurry of fists and kicks, not giving him a chance to return fire. Rocks splintered, flying everywhere. Their bodies moved all over the place as Izuku fought with no restraint now that Kota was gone. Finally, the villain fell to the base of the mountain, on the jutting edge of the cliff, and did not get back up. Panting, Izuku punched the villain one more time across the face, his head bouncing off the rock, like his own had done previously. After that, he stepped back, panting. Was the villain even breathing? Izuku suddenly turned and vomited his entire dinner right in front of the villain, splattering the guy's shoes with half-digested meat and potato stew. He took a second to catch his breath and wipe his mouth before leaping off the cliff face, hitting the ground hard enough to create a crater and cause a blast of wind. Izuku took off running from there. He needed to find a teacher to give Kota over to, then find Mandalay so she could tell everyone that the villains were looking for Kacchan. He needed to make sure that everyone was alive, and then he... Izuku! Izuku slid to a stop, kicking up dirt, chest heaving, eyes wide and crazed. He must have presented quite the sight with his torn clothes and bloodied face because Aizawa's eyes widened. "Sensei!" Izuku exclaimed. "Here, take Kota!" Izuku lifted a hand, palm down, brow furrowing. Kota dropped to the ground, hyperventilating. "Kota, it's all right, I beat him. It's okay now, you're safe." Izuku crouched, hugging the boy against him, making sure to keep a finger up on each hand. Izuku looked up at Aizawa over the kid's head, with slightly blurred vision. "I have so much to tell you," Izuku gasped out. Aizawa leaned in closer, eyes narrowed. "Kid, you have a concussion." "What?" Izuku shook his head, then stood, squeezing Kota comfortingly before pushing him toward Aizawa, who took him instinctively. "It doesn't matter. Take care of Kota. I have to find Mandalay," he said with frenetic energy, turning to leave. "Wait, Izuku!" Aizawa yelled, and Izuku froze, looking back. "Tell her I give everyone permission to fight back with quirks," Aizawa stated simply, making sure Izuku understood in his concussed state. Izuku nodded, and then took a step, before freezing yet again. "I found a sword, and I stabbed a villain," Izuku said. "I left him on the cliff. I hope he's not dead." Then Izuku shot forward, leaving a very concerned teacher in his wake, mumbling to himself. "Kid found a sword and stabbed a villain. How does that even happen?" Izuku returned to the clearing to find Tiger and Mandalay locked in battle. Izuku crashed forward, kicking one villain in the face and then springboarding off of him and slamming his fist into the other, knocking them both away instantly. "Mandalay!" Izuku shouted, landing on his feet and sliding. "Kota's okay. The villains are after Kacchan, and Aizawa said all the students can fight back with our quirks. Please tell everyone. I need to go find Kacchan." Izuku took off, leaving the two villains to Tiger and Mandalay and darting into the woods. Izuku ran in the direction he believed Kacchan would be in, panting heavily, wiping the drying blood away from his eyes as Mandalay made the announcement. He was close to where he thought Shoto and Kacchan should be when a huge, red and black swirling aura suddenly encompassed Izuku's vision, and he froze in abject shock. No one had an aura like that. Something snatched Izuku to the side as the aura passed by right where Izuku had been, and he found himself pressed against Shoji's side. "Was that?" Izuku whispered, breath whistling slightly, as shadows were rising all around. "Dark Shadow," Shoji nodded, not releasing Izuku. "He's taken over Tokiyami." Izuku frowned. Something would have driven Dark Shadow to do this. Izuku knew his aura had never been so dark before, and Tokiyami usually had such good control of him. "We were ambushed by villains and I covered us," Shoji explained, as if in answer to Izuku's thoughts. But that triggered the quirk he'd been desperately trying to hold back. Izuku straightened against Shoji's side, his hand on his own ribs, broken ribs. "I was headed to Kacchan anyway," Izuku said. "He should be with Shoto. They both have fire. They can help Tokiyami regain control if we lead them there." "How did you come up with that plan so fast?" Shoji asked, almost in awe. "I don't know. I'm concussed. Let's go." Izuku turned to go while Shoji shook his head at the guy's antics. Izuku didn't know what had happened in his life to lead him here, as bait to a rogue quirk running to rescue his oldest bully, What even was his life? "There! I see ice!" Izuku yelled, adjusting his trajectory with Shoji running near him. "They're fighting!" They sprinted into the path where Izuku could see his classmates diving out of the way at the last second as a rampant dark shadow hit the villain the two had been fighting. "Kachan!" Izuku yelled from where he'd rolled to the side. "Hurry up and make light," Shoji demanded from where he had dived into the opposite direction of Izuku. "Tokiyami's out of control." "Wait," Kachan said, watching with narrowed eyes as Dark Shadow indiscriminately attacked everything around him, including the villain they had been struggling with, literally tossing the villain into a tree like he was nothing. After that, they were able to subdue Dark Shadow with their fire, and Tokiyami dropped to his knees, panting, tears running down his face. "Are you two all right?" Izuku asked, approaching Tokiyami, eyeing both of their auras. Dark Shadow's smaller aura was located at Tokiyami's chest, a contrast to his own purple and white one. "Sorry, Shoji," Tokiyami said hoarsely. "You too, Midoriya." Izuku said, crouching down. "Call me Izuku, and you don't have to be sorry. It happens, Tokiyami. It's okay. And you and Dark Shadow defeated that villain, so no trouble." Izuku stood back up, looking toward the blonde. "Kachan, you're one of the targets." "I heard, damn nerd. How'd you figure that out?" Kachan growled. Izuku shrugged. "I think the camp is the safest place since there are 2 pros there. Both Aizawa and Blood King should be there." "I see," Tokiyami nodded. "So now our mission is to escort Bakugo there, huh?" "Yeah." Izuku rubbed a hand against his aching eyes, pushing the escaped hair from his braid out of his face. "But at the clearing, the pussycats are still fighting. I think we should just cut straight across instead of taking the path." "There might be more villains," Shoto warned. "I think together we'll all be fine," Izuku said resolutely, squaring his shoulders. "Honestly, with this group, we could probably even go up against All Might." "What's with you guys?" Kachan screamed. "You walk in the middle," Shoto told him, adjusting the student on his back. "What? No! I don't need protected by scum!" he howled. Izuku's eyes hardened before he turned slightly and pointed behind the angry blonde. "Oh my gosh!" he yelled, and everyone looked. Kachan turning all the way, his body tense. Izuku walked forward and slapped Kachan's arm, ripping him and his childish attitude off the face of the earth, leaving only the lingering smell of ozone. Izuku turned, wiping his hands together as if to get rid of something dirty. "Good. Now that that's taken care of, let's go before he throws a fit and tries to give me a stroke or something." Everyone blinked at him. "You're quite harsh, Izuku," Tokiyami said. Izuku smiled at him, and Tokiyami shuddered before following them as they moved along. It seemed Kachan had enough common sense not to try to kill Izuku, because he could feel him in his mindscape, tearing up grass or something, but not using his quirk. They came across Ochako and Sue being attacked, and Izuku attempted to run to their aid, but the villain ran off at the sight of them, knowing she was overpowered. The others, except for Tokiyami and Izuku, jumped to the girls' aid, while Izuku watched the villain's receding back, frowning. She'd given him a weird look. A presence behind him had Izuku whirling around, feet scraping in the dirt. But something grabbed his arm, and then all of a sudden he was surrounded by absolute darkness. Small and useless and afraid. So afraid. Izuku had told himself he would go to the training camp so that he wouldn't get scared by villains anymore, but here he was, trapped in the tiniest fucking space ever, terrified out of his damn mind. Nothing ever changed. Izuku didn't know how long he spent in the minuscule space, minutes, or it could have been hours later. He was suddenly forced back into the land of the living, a hand around his throat, Shoto's desperate eyes on his. Izuku's eyes widened dramatically at the pressure just beneath his Adam's apple. Hand around his throat, blackening vision, flickers of flame in a grinning mouth. Shigaraki's decaying touch on his neck. Pain. So much pain. Izuku roared, snapping his head forward, his hand lifting as he flung Kachan out of his mindscape as hard as possible. He knew he had to get him out of his mindscape before Izuku accidentally killed him in his rapidly rising panic, The blonde went flying, and Shoji leapt up, wrapping his arms around him. Izuku dropped to the ground and onto his knees, screaming profanities as the sky lit up vivid orange around him, state of mind in hyperdrive. Every living thing within a several-mile radius registering as lava rain suddenly poured down, avoiding animals and every human signature that Izuku recognized. Everything else burned. The villains cried out in agony, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. People were yelling, moving, running. Sound assaulted Izuku from every direction, and he screamed to cover it up, hands clutching at his head. The world around him grew hotter, as the lava rain ignited more trees, more brush. Methane gas, produced as the lava rain buried vegetation, migrated into subsurface voids beneath the earth throughout the forest and exploded as they heated, dirt clods cascading through the air. "Izuku!" a voice screamed, breaking through his own fear and noise. He looked up, unable to breathe or see correctly. His vision doubled, and the fiery rain obstructed almost everything. Shoto was looking behind Izuku, the boy's mismatched eyes filled with the most terror Izuku had ever seen. The safe space around him following the fire and ice user as he sprinted toward Izuku. The ground itself was covered in lava, though, and Shoto stumbled and fell as his shoe melted to the ground. Izuku followed where Shoto's line of sight had been before falling, turning just in time to see a boot coming toward his face. It connected, breaking his nose, snapping his head back. A hand grabbed him before he could fall the rest of the way down, and he was back inside the tiny space. Alone. Afraid. When Ochako had asked them where Izuku was, Shoto at first had been confused. But then he turned and both Tokiyami and Izuku had been gone, with Bakugo in Izuku's mind, 3 people missing, without even a sound heard. Then that villain had shown up, with the horrible marbles, and they had chased him down with a half-assed plan constructed on the fly. They somehow managed to catch up, and Shoto had been so sure Shoji had gotten all of them back. Then the fire villain said Bakugo had only been a secondary target. Izuku had been the main target, and everything had played into the League's hands as Shoto realized they only had ice in the marbles. Then everything happened so fast, and Shoto could barely keep track of any of it. Aoyama shot a laser at Mr. Compress, and the real marbles fell out of his mouth. Shoji and Shoto both shot off like bullets, Shoto's hand reaching over the marble closest to him, his heart a barrage against his ribcage. A hand lashed out, knocking Shoto aside, and he stumbled, dropping to one knee, driven back by a flare of fire. "No!" he screamed. Izuku appeared, the villain's hand around his throat, right over his scar. Shoto watched as his best friend's eyes widened in pure horror and fear, realizing, registering the hand restraining him. Something foreign and terrified spread in Izuku's eyes, turning them a harsh red before he suddenly roared, body jerking forward as he flung his hand up. Bakugo went soaring across the sky rapidly, too stunned to direct his arc with his quirk, and Shoji leapt up to catch him, dropping back to the ground rapidly. Meanwhile, Izuku collapsed onto his knees, dropping from the villain's hand to the ground and screaming, a sound like a cornered animal. The villains stepped out of the portal, reaching for Izuku's form as Shoto charged them. Suddenly, the entire area was awash with orange light as a torrent of lava rain burst into being, falling around them, hitting everywhere but them, Shoto realized. Fires burst into life around them as lava collected, coating everything, forming quick streams along the ground which began rupturing, exploding upward, dirt forming a deluge upon them. The villains were screaming in pain, their flesh sizzling, muscle burning away to reveal the sinew and fibers inside. Izuku was on the ground, holding his head, howling. Behind Izuku, the fire villain, Dabi they called him, reached for the green-haired boy, and Shoto pushed himself harder. "Izuku!" he shrieked. Izuku was going to be taken. Shoto was... He was so fucking desperate to get to him. Izuku looked up, crying tears of blood from his red eyes. Shoto suddenly stumbled, tripping as his shoe melted to the ground, his knee landing in a small puddle of lava, pain sparking every nerve in his leg. There was a sickening thunk as Dabi smashed his boot into Izuku's face and he fell backward. Seemingly in slow motion, Compress's hand had jerked forward and seized Izuku's arm, and then he was gone, and they all disappeared, falling backward into the warp gates. The rain stopped. Someone pulled Shoto out of the puddle of lava, and he fell onto his butt, watching where Izuku had been. Izuku was gone. He was gone. Shoto screamed. All right, listeners, this concludes the second half to Chapter 15 of State of Mind. Chapter 16 will be up next. I hope you all are still enjoying this fic. I'm really eager to hear what you all thought of how the author put together this chapter. Let me know your reactions in those comments below. And as always, thank you all so much for listening.